Our next speaker is Peter Lowen. He is the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. He is also a professor in the Department of Political Science, the director of Pearl, and the director of the Schwartz-Reisman Institute, a senior fellow at Massey College, a fellow at the Public Policy Forum, and a visiting professor in the Policy Institute at King's College London. Please welcome Peter Lowen.
Thanks very, very much. I'm going to introduce our panel in just a second. Before I do that, though, indulge me for 15 seconds. I want to tell you a story, which is that that a couple of years ago, we had a free speech issue, academic freedom issue at U of T. It was very contentious. Jamil Jaffer was a fellow at the Munk School, and he resigned on principle over that. And I've never had the occasion to tell Jamil how much I admired his doing that. And I want us all to give him a big hand for that courage. So I've got the great pleasure of moderating this conversation, which is majority Canadian. Doesn't happen very often in New York, but we're going to make something of that fact. So rather than read these long bios, I'm going to introduce our three speakers, and I'm going to give them a chance to tell you what's most important about who they are and what they do in the context of this discussion of applications of emerging tech to democracy. So please join me first in welcoming from Consumer Reports, their Director of Impact Partnerships, Amira Dalla. Amira? You want to head up? Great. We have the CEO of Goodbot, Renee Black. Renee? And finally, we have the lead for Global AI, not Al, AI Solutions at Accenture, Noelle Robinson. Noelle, please.
So actually, it's Russell, but my maiden name is Robinson, which is why it's so weird that you said that. Anyway, but we'll carry on.
Just doing what the algorithm told me to do. Sorry. So this is a really interesting panel, I hope, but I think it will be, for a couple of reasons. We've been talking actually a lot about regulation up to this point, which is another way of saying public policy, so a very interesting thing, of course. But in a large part, we've been talking about the tech world and technology as it is, not where it's going or what it could be. And I think we have a really interesting chance now to do a bit of a pivot and to talk about what emerging technology is going to look like, how it's going to impact our experience of being together with each other, of being democratic citizens in free countries, and maybe have a bit of a conversation about how we can put that on the best path possible. But to do that, to kind of set it up, what I want to do is just give each of our panelists a chance to say something about who they are and what they're working on, so you can kind of understand not only what their passions are, but what their frame is as we come into this conversation. So Amira, can I start with you and just take a few minutes and tell us about you and what you do and emerging tech?
Yeah, most definitely. So thank you for that introduction. My name is Amira Dalla, and I'm the Director of Partnerships and Programs for Privacy and Security at Consumer Reports, which means I get to use Consumer Reports, testing, research, and advocacy tools while working with organizations and consumers to making sure that we're staying safe in our digital world. And it's a really opportune time to be working on that, because when we think about things like responsible technology, we need coalitions and groups and organizations from across the ecosystem to be working on these issues and thinking about how we make them more privacy-centric, consumer and human rights-centric, safe-centric, and not just when we're designing them, but when we're implementing them. And the work we're doing is really focused on how we're bringing that all together and how we're really monitoring and holding organizations, governments accountable and sharing that with people.
Renee, tell us about Goodbot and yourself.
Yeah, so my background actually is a little bit different. I actually come originally from the private sector, but more recently my background was in peace and security space, and I worked in, I ran a nonprofit called Peace Geeks in Canada for 10 years that I founded, and I was working a lot with grassroots peace builders, and one of the conclusions that I drew from this work was that the scale of the problems and the nature of the problems are so big that there's no way that the tech for good space is going to be able to deal with them, and that we need more robust solutions for trying to deal with what is happening. And so I'd love to get back to my peace building work. Actually, I think that that's where my heart is, but I know that I can't do that until some of these issues are addressed. Goodbot is really thinking about how do we put some structure around frameworks to try to address some of these issues. We're going to be thinking about this concept of social sustainability and what does that look like? How do we start to nudge companies in the right direction? How do we move multi-stakeholder conversations to get us there?
Well,
Hello. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you, David. So super grateful to be here. I come from industry. So my journey into the world of AI and really responsible tech in general started at Alexa. I was employee 10 on the Alexa productization team and didn't know then what we were doing. And so after we finished that, after 4 years there, learned a lot about questions I wished I had asked beforehand. I was an anomaly, not just as a woman and as a Hispanic woman, but also as a mom and a caregiver. And so brought a lot of questions to the table that people were like, why are you asking this? So that launched me into responsible AI. I then went to Microsoft during a time where they were launching democratized AI for everyone, which at the time I thought, again, was noble and really good idea and we were launching not just voice, but computer vision and all of these technologies. And so democracy meant a little bit different to me because it was like, let's democratize all of this good stuff until I became aware of how people were using it. And I was like, oh, wait, no, not you in the garage and you over there behind the door. And even you, young person who just doesn't know what they're doing. And so now I work at Accenture really to deliver on the promise of a thread in every conversation of our Fortune 100 companies. How do you make sure that it's not a raisin in a bun, this responsible AI thing, that it's more of like water in a wave, if you get the analogy, right? It needs to be in and through everything. And someone mentioned earlier, like, right now, it's voluntary. And so I use every persuasive power that I have to convince companies to do it voluntarily. But yeah, we're in a crux right now of like, how do we make that real enough so it sticks? Because we all see what happens when it doesn't stick. So I'm trying to, that's what I do. I'm very much on industry. I work on healthcare, financial services, basically regulated industry, because that's where I'm concerned the most.
I'm going to confess something, which is that I don't really know what we mean when we talk about responsible tech, and maybe I shouldn't be so honest. I should just say that when people ask you what is responsible tech, what do you tell them it is? Well,
yeah, so I of course have tenants, but this is not a new concept actually. Since like the 50s, there people were worried about killing us all. So it's not new, but it comes down to a couple things just to be brief about it, right? Transparency, we've all heard. How do we make sure that we preserve data lineage of how decisions are made by technology we don't fully understand? Explainability, how do I make sure CEOs know what that means? Robustness, how do I make sure I build software that can survive when people need it the most, which is sadly what the airlines struggle with every time we have a snowstorm. And then most importantly, fairness and trust. And those are like the key words. You can go down rabbit holes in any of those and you'd be landing on responsible decisions we need to make about the technology that we're building every day.
Amira, what's your experience working with companies that are really, like, I think probably genuinely trying to puzzle through how they use technology responsibly, but even how they understand what is technology that they have to apply responsible tech principles to, and which stuff is just a tool that they don't need to worry about? What's your experience in working with companies on this?
Yeah, I'll say in the work that we're doing and the work that we often bring with companies together, it's like there's many different frameworks. Like everyone's in an ideal way saying people want trust, consumers want trust, but they're like, this is the framework that's going to get us there. So I think we need some sort of standardization on what we mean when we say trust and transparency. Like, what are the frameworks, tools, regulations that we're actually asking people to uphold that are on by default? And I have to be really clear when I say that, because so many times in society right now, companies are leveraging privacy and security as a brand point. They are putting out there that their tools are secure, that you can do these things with them, your data is private. And so many times when we actually do some of the testing at Consumer Reports, we're finding that these aren't default things. They're actually in the back ends where a consumer has to dig into the settings to turn them on. And right now, individuals do not have the skill sets or the understanding or awareness to actually know when to do what. And so when we think about trust and safety, and those are great things to bring up, and I always talk about how do we design with privacy, security in mind, human rights at the beginning. I always talk with companies or individuals or coalitions about how do we design and create for the person who stands to lose the most, who is the most potentially in danger and risk, And then how do we make sure that everyone else is able to build upon that afterwards?
Renee, I'll come to you on this because I know you've spent a lot of the last couple of years sort of scoping out where the real gaps are in practice from both voluntary nonprofit organizations, but also governments and for-profit organizations. And what do you see as kind of the biggest gap that exists in the capacity for us to put a check mark on something being responsible or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. I mean, but I think there is a growing divide between the conversation that's having at the civil society level and what's happening at the tech company level. And I think that there's a need to bridge that. I think that part of the other issue is that there's been so much information shared about with the public about what are the various forms of harms. And some of them are at the surface level or, at the more immediate level. And some of them are down, further upstream with the decision making around what business models you're choosing and who is making those decisions and, what's the composition of your team. And it's the algorithms. There's an outsized attention on algorithms, but there are so many things beyond algorithms. So how do we start to structure some of this information in a way that's much more accessible and actionable for the public, but also that bridges the conversations between nonprofits and companies?
Amira, where are we going to be in 5 years with the capacity of organizations like Consumer Reports has done amazing work for decades on really summarizing information about products for people? I mean, where do you see the kind of private information sphere being in 5 years in terms of its capacity to really have a whole of field view on whether companies are using technology responsibly? Can an organization like Consumer Reports and other kind of third-party organizations do it all, or do you see a necessary role for government or for other types of organizations?
Well, I don't know where we're going to be next year, to be quite honest. That's a question I don't know. With generative AI, we need so many more things right now than we have needed before. But yeah, I mean, the short answer to that is definitely. I don't think it's alone. It's not, we can't leave it up to the corporations alone and for companies alone to make those decisions. Because when we do, what we're seeing is, Noelle, we're seeing individuals who are working for these companies that are unaware of how their impact is leading a product, or we're seeing companies that are driven by profit. And we need regulations and we need supervision on a government level, coalition level. We need all tech is human type organizations out there, really trying to build the ecosystem with diverse groups of people and mindsets in mind.
I don't want to be a total homer, but I will say that Canada's been working very hard recently, but with fits and starts on trying to just start to regulate online space, let alone all these other things. And I to Renee's point, Renee, you sort of said we talk about algorithms all the time, and it's true. And I think we really think that the totality of the harms caused by AI and by technology is just limited to a few platform companies, right? But in fact, we're talking about general purpose technologies that are going to be throughout everything, right? So, Noelle, I wanted to come to you on this because you're working at a company that's kind of implementing AI solutions, I'm sure, through all sorts of things you can't talk about, but through all sorts of business lines and practices. So what's the conversation like when you're talking to clients at Accenture about sort of how they should think about the responsible use of technology when they may not even think that what they're doing is AI or what they're doing actually has an ethical component to it?
Yeah. So one thing I didn't mention is what I do now. So today I run we just started a center of excellence at Accenture around generative AI. And the reason for this is not because of the very small generative AI box, which is the tool that does that work and the models that do that work, but all the things that need to surround it. So one of the reasons why I like being part of an organization like this is that we recognize patterns. So I saw this pattern at Alexa, I saw it at Microsoft. I'm now seeing it with generative AI, which is we're building these solutions to solve a business problem. They want to make better conversations with their customers. Great. Now I'm going to implement generative AI. And what they don't realize is that as our models get better, and they're getting better literally every hour, we're making it better every time we use them. But those models are getting better. But what ends up happening is that we don't realize that we're also seeing amplification of bias get worse. Everything is amplified, not just the cool ability for it to build me an RFP, but also that it's going to amplify every bias in that data set that it used exponentially, to the tune of trillions. So what I see now is what I'd spend every day doing is talking to customers about the importance of not the generation part, though that's cool, but the content moderation part, the content verification part, how do you make sure your model's not lying or hallucinating? I have a prompt that I write into my solutions now that says, do not tell lies. I literally say that to my machine learning algorithms, and it works. It goes and makes sure there's 3 sources of information it can find before it identifies it as true. These are things that, again, are optional, that not everyone even understands, is to your point, right? Companies don't even know that that's something they're supposed to do. So it's a bit of an evangelist moment right now, where we're going and just trying to say, this is a new world. We have to think first. So we use inclusive engineering practices from the beginning, before they're like use case identification. We're talking about responsible AI. And now the good news is that there's massive failure. AI gone wrong is a Google alert I monitor daily. And there's plenty of reason for companies to listen. Where 5 years ago, we didn't have that, right? I couldn't say, look at all of your friends who have failed miserably. Don't be that. Now we do, whether that's good or not, but it's helpful in the conversations.
It's a long conversation, all the ways that AI can go wrong. Amira, what's the thing that you're most worried about? What's the trend that you're most worried about when you think about the next generations of AI from a consumer or non-consumer perspective? What's the thing that's worrying you the most?
Yeah, I'll start by saying I worry a lot. I do. I'm like usually the person ringing the alarm on emerging technology, because I'm like, we got to think about all these things, or they're not built out yet. And so, I mean, at this moment in time, it's hard for me to not think about the impacts of generative AI as we think about how much we already know in its ability to spread fake news or misinformation, which it already did in the 2020 election and going forward. I think about with someone with a cybersecurity and security background, how well they can create phishing emails, which they've already done, and get into like both infrastructure and people's homes. But I also think a lot about like smart cities, and that's a term that's been around for about a decade. That's really been how we build better infrastructure that's more efficient. It's better equipped for people. It moves things along. It is like, in essence, something that all cities are still pushing to do in various ways. And I think about what it means when we hook up our power grids, our transportation, our water to all these secure systems. I know that intentionally we want to create them to be secure, but I also know that that poses a lot of risk. And I think about the front line of cybersecurity and cyber civil defense, whether it is people's onslaught of IoT devices in their homes, which are safe, convenient, they're fun, I get it, but there are so many vulnerabilities in that and how we're equipping people. So I worry a lot. I think about all these things. I think about more things, but I really think about how all these things connect and how we're really bracing individuals with the progression of technology in the last like 10 years alone, how our skill sets should have changed and should be changing. So whether we are equipping ourselves with the necessary privacy, security, and data skill sets to actually deal with all these new updates that we're getting around us. And if we're not there, what do we need to do more?
Renee, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that was just said. I mean, I think the concentration of power, I think, is a big issue, and the growing asymmetries that exist. So if I think about, as a nonprofit organization, if I'm trying to hold somebody accountable, the asymmetry of money, the asymmetry of talent, the asymmetry of knowledge that I have, the asymmetry of data that I have access to, there's so much that is preventing me from being able to be as effective as a company is at creating harm. And I mean, I guess the other component, and this is like, as I think about the peace building piece, you can automate harm. It's not as easy to automate peace. There's so much more manual intervention that has to go into trying to do that. You can get to a certain point, but at a certain point, trust building requires people to come together. That's not something that you can automate in the same way as you can perpetuate harms. And our brains don't have a hard time unlearning disinformation. So again, there's this asymmetry of what is required to undo harms along the way. That's the thing that concerns me, that there's already this massive set of asymmetries and they're just growing. And we need mechanisms to prevent that asymmetry from taking over.
Well, how about you?
I'm most worried about, I think I'm probably most worried about literacy because I have 6 children and my dad lives with me and none of them really understand why I have the restrictions that I have. They're very grateful they have a tech mom, but I'm worried about literacy. I'm worried about a level of equality of understanding of what this can and how it could hurt you. I think especially with our aging population, I'll give you a very specific example here in New York. A ring was installed on a bunch of apartment buildings, and in order to enable it, everyone had to use a QR code. And 90% of the people in these buildings are not QR code people. Like they're like, there's a fingerprint thing, and I'm not really sure. And it immediately isolated them from being able to use technology to protect their home. They finally figured out, but there was a huge amount of friction there. And even parking lots, right? We now need a QR code to get a parking spot. If you are of a certain demographic, you may not ever be able to do that. It immediately isolates people. So I think both on the side of us building the solutions, like, man, QR codes are cool, but what about, how do I keep this accessible? I have a son with Down syndrome, so I'm always thinking about accessibility, but it's even just knowledge, just knowing this, I think, changes how we develop systems and solutions in general. So that's literacy is my biggest concern. And it's something that we all like, right? You all just learned something. Now we can all be teachers and post on LinkedIn. No, wait, that's a platform. Wait, never mind. No, we don't do that. Okay.
Okay, so this isn't good because I asked you guys what worries you, and Amira told us it's really system level stuff, geopolitics, lack of capacity to actually set up infrastructure in a way that's robust. Renee says it's actually one level down. It's companies that are too powerful, and Noelle says it's people not understanding how to use technology. So there's not a spot where we're not being worried. So this is pretty complete. We'll turn it around now. We'll turn it around. Job security, exactly. For professors, yeah. I'll turn it around, Noelle, and ask you what you see that is kind of emerging that makes you most hopeful. And if I can ask you actually with a bit of precision, what makes you, of all the kind of problems we've heard about today, like what are you seeing that actually makes you think that we can turn the corner on some of these things that we're really worried about, that we've heard about for the last 3 panels and for this one?
So I like the idea that we heard, they didn't call it rational optimism, but basically we're relatively optimistic, which gives me hope. But I will tell you that everything, like these are not new conversations. Of course, we've been having these conversations, especially since Alexa. I would walk off stage and just get people just bombarding me with, why does Alexa listen to my husband more than me? And I'm like, oh, right, we didn't train it on female data. Sorry, right? Like those, there's hundreds of those types of examples of, we didn't think about that. Like, what do you want? We thought you'd use 1 device in your kitchen. Now you use an average of 5 devices for all sorts of things. So I think one of the things I'm most hopeful about, though, is that when I am going into companies, and I've been doing this now for almost 10 years, companies are asking me for my responsible AI playbook. They're asking me for these tools and technologies. And that used to be a hard sell. I'd have a team and I'd have to fight to keep that team employed. Now clients are like, okay, great. Thanks for the tech. How are we doing this safely? And that's a trend that I didn't see before. And that's not in the news. As a matter of fact, I'm restricted from saying that I'm having those conversations with most of my clients, which I think is weird. I'm like, scream it from the rooftops. But the Fortune 100, the Fortune 500, they're like very focused on this. They don't want to be selfishly the next Wall Street Journal AI gone wrong story. So I think that's probably my biggest inspiration, is that the projects I'm building have responsible AI built in. And that was different than even 2 years ago.
Renee.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different conversations going on right now. There's a set of conversations that are focused on how do we fix the existing problems right now, both with policy and with technical changes. And then there's other conversations that are actually really just trying to, get rid of that frame and try to think like from a bit of a, from a from scratch model, like thinking about how do you just sort of do this differently. I just came from the Social Cohesion and Technology Conference in San Francisco, which was really a great event. And so, there's really interesting people there working on bridge building algorithms. And then there's people thinking about, pro-social design. And there's, people are thinking about like, how do we design technology taking into account, in urban planning, where we're in this very kind of early stage of technology. We've kind of now run up, where there was like the enthusiasm, and then now there's the problems, and then there's the anxiety about the problems. And so now there's an opportunity to reframe. And I guess the other part that makes me excited is that there's so many smart, intelligent, thoughtful people putting their energy to these conversations. And technology is one of the spaces where we don't have to tear down physical infrastructure. We can build new tools now. I think that a big challenge is because competition, especially when it comes to big tech, is getting in the way of new positive technology coming through the pipeline. That is a barrier. And so that's something I would like to see. But I mean, I think there's the roots there for some good new alternatives to come through.
Amira, do you have any room for hope?
I know. It's like, I like the spectrum. It's like, I brought you so far down with me, but like, we're going to go up. We're going to go up. I have some optimism. I actually have a really specific use case example that has been really like in my mind recently. And disclaimer, I have nothing to do with this field. So this is something that has been shared with me actually by my sister, who works on AI implementation in hospitals out of Toronto with an institute called Vector Institute. So it's really cool. I think what healthcare is doing with AI has a lot of potential for good. I sometimes get worried about the potential for bad, but this example is really cool, where she has been working on a program called ChartWatch. And what ChartWatch does is when an individual comes into the hospital, it uses predictive modeling to assess them into different buckets and say whether they are going to be red code, green code, yellow code, and whether they will need the ICU or have a probability of death. Pretty intense stuff. But with this model, they've been able to do tons of silent runs, work on designing it with the hospitals, with the staff in place, making sure they feel comfortable, that they understand what's happening. And get this, they have seen a 20% reduction in mortality rates in that hospital. And I thought that, I know, ooh, you thought that's cool too. I thought it was amazing. I was like, this is the best. Like, okay, why is this not in every hospital? Like, this is in one hospital in Toronto, like scale this immediately. And she held me back, like you would as a good older sister. And she was like, well, every hospital is surrounding different communities. So what we're doing now is we're working on understanding the demographics of every hospital to understand how the predictive model changes. And I thought that was so thoughtful. And when I think about emerging tech and being responsible, like that's the sort of thoughtfulness we need to make things like healthcare, which are fundamental to everyone, like work for everyone. And so I found a lot of inspiration from that. And I think that there's so many ways in which people are in this industry and coming from different backgrounds, jumping into AI now, who are thinking about really individuals, consumers, and people at the forefront.
So the really great thread that goes through all of this, right, is that what all of you have talked about as things that are hopeful for you are not actually, pains me to say as a person who runs a policy school, they're not actually policy solutions. It's about literacy and, as you say, thoughtfulness and engagement and kind of just having a better vision about what you could do with technology if you bring the right values to it. I think that's a great thread on which to end this. So I really want to ask you to join me with a very appreciative round of applause for Noelle and Renee and Amira.